I want to start our time with a story. Once upon a time, there was a man who fell in love with the most beautiful creature he had ever laid his eyes on, himself. Narcissus was his name. He was the son of a river god and water nymph, so his family life was just like yours and mine. And from an early age, he was special. He was a talented athlete, he was a remarkable hunter, and above all else, he was stunningly handsome. The guy made Glen Powell look like the Hunchback of Notre Dame. Which meant he was a walking thirst trap. Both women and men would throw themselves after him with vows of rapturous affection and commitment. And yet Narcissus either ignored or spurned all of those possible prospects because none of them could really hold up to his beauty, to his excellence. And one day, he was walking out in the woods, and he grew tired and thirsty, and so he found himself wandering this path until eventually he came upon a clear pool of water from which he could drink. And so he fell to his knees in joy. He turned his gaze to the water, and just then caught sight of a hauntingly beautiful young man looking back towards him. This was the first time he'd ever seen himself with such clarity. And so he spent the rest of the day getting acquainted with every perfect angle of himself. The glinting and gorgeous eyes, the perfectly glowing curls of hair, the definition of his muscles, the jawline that had been so perfectly formed from years of mewing. And the whole day continued that way, as did the evening. He fell asleep under the moonlight with his fingers lightly grazing the face of his newfound love. Days passed, but he never departed. And eventually, he decided it was time to take the next step in their relationship. And so slowly, romantically, he leaned in for a kiss, grasping to embrace this beautiful figure. But as he did, the water rippled, and his love suddenly disappeared. His heart was broken, knowing for the first time the agony of unrequited love. But he remained steadfast, and the process repeated itself. His love would return, he would seek to embrace them, and they'd disappear again. Days turned into weeks that wasted away, and Narcissus began to waste away with them. He ate and drank nothing. His neck began to ache from leaning over the water. His legs became rooted to the grass upon which he lay, and eventually, all that was left of him were a collection of white and yellow flowers, bending over the water to catch a glimpse of their reflection in the pool. His truest love, himself, had destroyed him, never able to be grasped, never able to satisfy the deepest longings of his soul. So goes the myth of Narcissus. It's a tragedy told by the Greek poet Ovid back in the year 8 CE. His name, Narcissus, if you hadn't noticed yet, is where we get the word narcissism in our culture. And for thousands of years, this story has been told as a warning to all people in all places. Making self the center of our lives will only ever lead us to destruction. But friends, we live in a culture that has not heeded the message. In fact, our culture, modern Western American culture, has claimed just the opposite. We are being told that self-absorption, building a life that centralizes my worth, my desires, my safety, my security, my affirmation from others, that's the way to a meaningful, satisfying, influential sort of life. In fact, researchers have started to call this a culture of narcissism. Back in 1979, there was a historian named Dr. Christopher Lasch who wrote an entire book on this. It's called The Culture of Narcissism. And his central claim was simple. He said, since World War II, our consumeristic American culture has trained us to be people who see everything through a therapeutic lens of what can this do for me? How can all of these external things satisfy my needs and longings? And so the result is that we've been trained to be people who see every situation considering ourselves primarily. And so we'll use family or work. We'll use friends or church or spirituality simply for self-validation and security. And if we don't find them, then the problem must be out there with the externals. Certainly not with us. Here's a quote from his book that I think really captures well our culture. He says, "We demand too much of life and too little of ourselves." In the last 25 years, the patient increasingly confronts the psychiatrist not with well-defined symptoms of their difficulties, but with their dissatisfactions about life. He does not suffer from fixations or phobias or nervous ailments or emotional immaturity. Instead, he complains of vague, diffuse dissatisfactions with life. He describes subtly experienced yet pervasive feelings of emptiness and depression, violent oscillations of self-esteem, and a general inability to get along. And he gains a sense of heightened self-esteem only by attaching him to strong, admired figures whose acceptance he craves and by whom he needs to feel supported. He depends on others to validate his self-esteem, and yet happiness eludes him. In short, we see everything through the lens of satisfaction of self. And what Lasch was noticing back in the 70s has been recognized by mental health professionals today. In 2009, there were a couple psychologists who used a resource called the Narcissistic Personality Index, which is amazing that exists in general. The Narcissistic Personality Index is a tool to measure how self-focused we're becoming. And what they found is across the board, from the 1980s to the 2000s, narcissism was on the rise in every age demographic. We are more narcissistic as a culture now than we've ever been. They also found, in another journal article, that American workplaces reward narcissistic behavior. So things like excessive ego or desire for admiration or strategic self-promotion actually help people advance quicker in our workplaces. Many of our bosses and our political leaders are filled with narcissists. I can't even think of one. We have become, somebody said, Yeah. We have become, as researcher Will Storr put it, a selfie generation. Not only do we see more images of ourselves than any other culture in history, but we are immersed in social media and celebrity culture that tells us the approval of others is the thing that will validate our lives. And so we post in order to inject likes and comments into our veins. We enter into every space self-conscious about earning the approval of others or dissatisfied when we don't get the attention we are hoping for. And maybe worst of all, we lead lives that project an image of ourselves in order to get praise or approval. One of my favorite working musicians wrote a song all about this. It's called The Internet. His name's John Bellion. He said, "Life became dangerous the day we all became famous. No one cares if you're happy just as long as you claim it. How can we change this the day we all became famous? No one cares if you have it just as long as they think you do. I don't need the word, just need you to think I said it. I don't need to learn, just need you to think I get it. I don't need the sermon, just need you to think I read it." Friends, we all have some narcissus in us. And it's not a new problem. It's an ancient one. In fact, the scriptures and Jesus speak extensively about it. They have a word to describe it. It's called pride. Here's the definition. Pride is the ruthless and perpetual concentration on the self. It is a state of heart and mind that sees all things through the lens of self in ways that lead us to disdain or use things or people for our own recognition, acclaim, and approval. And throughout history, pride has been seen as the vice which gives rise to every other vice in our lives. Augustine, a 5th century theologian, put it this way. He said, "Pride is the beginning of sin." And what is pride but the craving for undue exaltation? It is the abandoning of God to whom the soul ought to cling as its source of life and to imagine itself instead as a source of its own life. It is the petri dish from which all sorts of ugly stuff starts. And just in case you're in a spot where you're like, I don't know if that's, here's a quick diagnostic. Are you quick to find faults in others and verbalize those thoughts? Do you expect that your needs are the primary needs or only needs when you enter into a group setting? Think about it. Do you think of yourself as more spiritual than others? Are you proud of the schedule you keep, how disciplined you are, and the things you're able to accomplish? Do you generally think that your way is the right way, only way, or best way? Do you have a hard time admitting when you're wrong? Do you look down on those who are less educated, affluent, successful, or refined than yourself? Are you driven to receive approval, praise, and acceptance from others? Are you prone to isolation from and rejection of others when they don't meet your needs? Do you become defensive when you're criticized? Do you talk about yourself too much? Are you sitting here thinking how many of those questions apply to someone you know, since none of those things apply to you? You guys, our narcissism, our pride is all over us, and it is destroying us. We need a different way of being in the world, a cure to this sickness in our time and place. We're continuing in a teaching series here at Midtown through the book of Esther. It's this amazing story from the Bible that tells of a young Jewish orphan girl who navigates a patriarchal and prideful and racist political and social climate and becomes a vehicle of justice precisely there for the poor and marginalized. It's an amazing story. And it teaches us how we can show up and have the same sort of influence as Esther and her cousin Mordecai in our own time. But it doesn't just have good examples, it also gives us some bad ones. And so today we get to explore one of the foremost bad examples, one of the foremost examples of pride in the whole of the Bible. And it's given to us as a warning and reminder that the type of influence and type of life we're looking for, the thing we're really deeply craving, comes only when we eradicate pride from our lives. So friends, if you have a Bible, I invite you to open it with me. We're going to be reading from Esther chapter 5, and then all the way through chapter 6. It's going to be a long scripture passage, but it's a story, so I think it'll be particularly engaging for us. If you don't have a Bible, by the way, that's okay. The words are going to be behind me on the screen, so you can follow along there. Esther chapter 5, starting in verse 1. On the third day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the king's palace, opposite the king's hall. The king was sitting on his royal throne inside the palace, opposite the entrance to the palace. As soon as the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court, she won his favor, and he held out to her the golden scepter that was in his hand. Then Esther approached and touched the top of the scepter. And the king said to her, "What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? Even to half of my kingdom it shall be given to you." Then Esther said, "If it pleases the king, let the king and Haman come today to a banquet that I have prepared for our king." And the king said, "Bring Haman quickly so that we may do as Esther desires." And so the king and Haman came to the banquet that Esther had prepared. And while they were drinking wine, the king said to Esther, "What is your petition? It shall be granted to you. What's your request? Even to the half of my kingdom it shall be fulfilled." Then Esther answered, "This is my petition and request. If I've won the king's favor, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition, fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come tomorrow to the banquet that I will prepare for them. And then I will do as the king has said." And Haman went out that day, happy and in good spirits. But when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate and observed that he neither rose nor trembled before him, he was infuriated with Mordecai. Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home. Then he sent and called for his friends and his wife Zeresh. And Haman recounted to them the splendor of his riches, the number of his sons, all the promotions with which the king had honored him, and how he had advanced him above all the officials and ministers of the king. And Haman added, "Even Queen Esther, let no one but myself come with the king to the banquet that she prepared. Tomorrow also I am invited by her together with the king. Yet all this does me no good, so long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate." Then his wife Zeresh and all his friends said to him, "Let a pole 50 cubits high be made, and in the morning tell the king to have Mordecai hung on it. Then go with the king to the banquet in good spirits." This advice pleased Haman, and he had the pole made. On that night the king could not sleep, and he gave orders to bring the book of records, the annals, and they were brought to the king. It was found written how Mordecai had told Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs who guarded the threshold and who had conspired to kill King Ahasuerus. Then the king said, "What honor or distinction has been bestowed upon Mordecai for this?" The king's servants who attended him said, "Nothing has been done for him." The king said, "Who's in the court?" Now Haman had just entered the outer court of the king's palace to speak to the king about having Mordecai hung on the pole that he had prepared for him. And so the king's servants told him, "Haman is there standing in the court." The king said, "Let him come in." So Haman came in, and the king said to him, "What shall be done for the man whom the king wishes to honor?" And Haman said to himself, "Well, whom would the king wish to honor more than me?" So Haman said to the king, "For the man whom the king wishes to honor, let royal robes be brought, which the king has worn, game-worn jerseys, and a horse that the king has ridden, with a royal crown on its head. Let the robes and the horse be handed over to one of the king's most noble officials. Let him robe the man whom the king wishes to honor, and let him conduct the man on horseback through the open square of the city, proclaiming before him, 'Thus shall it be done for the man whom the king wishes to honor.'" And the king said to Haman, "Quickly, take the robes and the horse as you have said, and do so to Mordecai, the Jew, who sits at the king's gate. Leave out nothing that you have mentioned." And so Haman took the robes and the horse and robed Mordecai and led him riding through the open square of the city, proclaiming, "Thus shall it be done for the man whom the king wishes to honor." Then Mordecai returned to the king's gate, but Haman hurried to his house, mourning with his head covered. When Haman told his wife Zeresh and all his friends everything that had happened to him, his advisors and his wife Zeresh said to him, "If Mordecai, before whom your downfall has begun, is of the Jewish people, you will not prevail against him, but you will surely fall before him." Amen. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. We left off last week with the story of Esther's remarkable bravery. Remember who she is. She's in exile amidst all of her people in the Persian Empire, and through a series of crazy events that included drunken parties and a twisted beauty pageant and all sorts of pomp and circumstance, she rises to become Queen of Persia, the largest empire in the land. But then things took a turn for the worse, because this weaselly advisor called Haman convinced the king to sign an order to have all the Jewish people in the empire killed on a particular date, all because Mordecai, one of those Jewish men, refused to bow to Haman. And so in the story last week, we learned that Mordecai, who's outside of the king's palace, pleads to Esther, who is inside the king's palace. She's insulated from all of this. And he says, Esther, you've got to use your position to do something, to advocate for the Jewish people and prevent this evil from happening. And we learned that despite the fact that this sort of advocacy on Esther's part could cost her her life, she decides to do the right thing, to stand for justice in a culture that is forgotten. She says, if I perish, I perish. And so now, in chapter 5, it's the execution of her plan. She's strategizing on how best to do this, because she knows that approaching the king unannounced can lead to death. In fact, she knows the last queen to be so bold was exiled. And so notice in the passage, she doesn't blindly storm into the king's court and demand that he change things, because she knows that might bring some anger out of him. She's more shrewd. When you're living as an exile in a culture, you need to be creative. And so when she approaches the king, notice what she does. She puts on her royal robes. It's a reminder to the king that she has real position and power and royalty. She is dressing for success. She means business with the king. And so the beauty queen of chapters 1 and 2 in Esther has gone away. It's now the powerful royal queen, Esther. And that works. The king is impressed by the fact that his beauty queen is not just beautiful. She is dignified, driven, powerful. And so rather than being angry, he welcomes her. And he notices that she's got something she might want to share. And so he asks her, what is it, Queen Esther? This is actually one of the first times that she's been referred to as Queen Esther in the whole story. He is recognizing her position and the power of her title. He says, what's your request? It shall be given to you, even in the half of my kingdom. T.I. would be so proud. You can have whatever you like. You weren't expecting a T.I. reference today. I know you weren't coming in here. But notice her response. Even after he says this, she still doesn't come right out and say it. She says she's got a special meal prepared just for him. She's trying to butter him up a little bit. She's basically saying, well, my king, I have a little something that I'd like, just a little thing, but I want it to be special. So I wanted to treat you, because I love you. I prepared this meal for you and gotten the best wine for you. I just want to share all of this with you, and we'll talk about it more there. And the king, you can picture like the heart eyes, the cartoon heart eyes. He's falling in love with Esther, and so he says, great, sounds good. I'll come to your banquet. And they bring, together with Haman, a banquet before them. And again, the king asks, what can I do for you, my queen? And again, she strings him along. She's like, my king, I've had such a great time tonight. It's been so great. Let's do this again. One more night. We'll have one more banquet, and then I'll tell you. And so they schedule another banquet. Just her, the king, and Haman. But before that banquet happens, which we'll read about a little bit next week, we actually get to hear Haman's perspective, which in the story feels like kind of an adjustment, right? We've been in the banquet and in the king's palace, and all of a sudden we're with Haman. Why? Right? Well, the point of the story is actually to contrast the efforts of Esther and Mordecai with the efforts of Haman. We're supposed to see them in contrast with one another. Esther and Mordecai are wise and shrewd and humble in approaching the king, and they're using their position for the sake of others. But Haman, he only cares for himself. He's driven only by pride, and it sets him on a course for destruction in the story. And so in this passage, we see three things, I think, about pride that we need to take away in our own time. We see first the nature of pride, second, the destructiveness of pride, and third, the cure for pride. The nature, the destructiveness, and the cure. First, the nature of pride. In chapter 5, verse 9, Haman leaves the banquet feeling pretty high on life. You may have noticed that. He's probably a little intoxicated at this point, and he's just reveling in how great he is because he was invited to a banquet with the queen and the king, and only him. He's important. He's special. But that doesn't last long for him. Immediately, he sees Mordecai, and he's reminded of, for as much power as he has, he's reminded of the fact that he's not honored by everyone. That there's still more people that are not bowing to him, that are not giving him the praise he deserves. And that infuriates him. And so he goes home. But notice what he does when he gets home. He immediately rattles off his resume. He tries to consult himself by reciting to his wife and friends, who definitely already know this information, how great he is. His riches, his offspring, his promotions, his position. He's like, guys, aren't I the best? No one works harder than me. Nobody's smarter. No one knows as much as me. No one compares with me. But it doesn't work. He's still depressed. All because that one guy didn't give him the admiration he was looking for. All he can see is the one thing he doesn't have. All he can see is the one way he's not winning. and he can't find consolation. There's no gratitude in him, there's no appreciation in him, there's only anxious insecurity. There's only a fragile view of self that can be utterly rocked by one person. And it's here we're getting a glimpse into the real nature of pride in a couple different ways. First, pride turns everything in our lives into a means to an end. Everything in our life becomes about making ourselves feel good about us. And so we don't enter into work thinking about how it might benefit others. We think about how it sets us up well, or how it can prove that we're the best. We don't enter into relationships thinking about how we might love others. We think about what they need to give us, how their approval can make us feel a certain way or satisfy our needs. Every part of our life sees things or others as a means to my end of getting approval or respect. It's endless ego calculation. Am I getting the thanks I deserve? Am I appreciated enough here? Am I getting enough attention? How do I look in this situation or photo? How am I regarded by others? Did I get enough likes? You're always saying it's about me, me, me. See, the interesting thing is that Haman never actually cared about any of those things. He cared about getting them so he could feel better about himself. Those things are means to a different end. C.S. Lewis describes it this way in his book, Mere Christianity, pretty brilliantly. He says, how much do I dislike it when other people snub me, or refuse to take any notice of me, or shove off? The point is that each person's pride is in competition with everyone else's pride. It is because I wanted to be the focus of things that I'm so annoyed at someone else being the focus. Pride gets no pleasure out of having something, only out of having more of it than the next man. We say that people are proud of being rich or clever or good-looking, but they are not. They are proud of being richer, cleverer, or better-looking than others. Pride sees everyone as a means to my end. It's self-absorption. And because that's true, pride can actually manifest itself in some sneaky ways. See, we often think of pride simply as superiority, but it's not just superiority. It's also inferiority. So the superiority side of pride is most obvious to us because usually those people are loudest about their pride. They're overly braggadocious or self-elevating. They think they're better than everyone, right? That's what Haman is doing when he lists off his accomplishments here. But he also shows us the second side. Notice that after listing off those accomplishments, he succumbs to inferiority. He says it's still not good enough. He believes he hasn't done enough. And the whole point is that he's just as self-absorbed. He's doing the ego calculation. And in both ways, he's either coming out way on top of everyone in a prideful way, or he's not coming out well enough. But the whole point is that he's viewing everything through the lens of self, his absorption. Friends, when you're overly down on yourself, when you're convinced that no matter how much people do or say that you're not good enough, when you discredit your gifts or think you're too far gone, that's all pride. Because it's self-absorption. You're consumed with the self and you're doing mental and emotional calculations. And we often miss that. See, we often think in our culture that humility means thinking less of ourselves. That's not humility. Humility is not thinking less of yourself, it's thinking of yourself less. It means having the ability to enter every situation, not needing approval, not needing respect, not needing attention or affirmation because you have an identity and self-awareness that transcends anything anyone might say or do. Which is why whenever you meet a humble person, you usually don't walk away thinking, man, how humble were they? You don't walk away thinking about them much at all because in the conversation, they were concerned with you, not them. They were concerned primarily with how you could be loved and cared for. They were not concerned primarily with how you were treating them. Their ego calculation is gone. They were relaxed in their identity. Henry Nouwen writes about this in his book, Life of the Beloved. He said, for a long time, I considered low self-esteem to be some kind of virtue. I've been warned so often against pride and conceit that I came to consider it a good thing to deprecate myself. But now I realize that the real sin is to deny God's first love for me, to ignore my original goodness. Because without claiming that first love and that original goodness for myself, I lose touch with my true self. And I embark on the destructive search among the wrong people and in the wrong places for what can only be found in the house of my Father. Yeah. What Nouwen knows and what we need to remember is that pride is a sneaky devil. It can manifest itself in superiority and inferiority. It can present itself as being humble, which means we need to become people who enter situations honestly reflective of why, honestly reflective of our motivations. Are we coming here to try to get approval or attention? Are we showing up thinking we're not good enough? Are we jealous of those who get more attention than us? Are we quick to insert our thoughts or opinions or experiences? Those questions can help us diagnose pride when it arises in us. Because if we don't diagnose it, we'll become like Haman. We'll become destructive people. That's the second thing we learn about pride in this story. It's destructiveness. Look at what his pride leads him to do. At his wife's suggestion, she's enabling his pride, he decides to build a giant stake in his backyard upon which he can ask the king to impale Mordecai. And just to give you perspective, this stake that he's constructing here, it's more than 7 stories high. It would be the tallest building, taller than the king's palace in Susa, the capital of Persia at the time. His solution is literally a giant monument to self upon which he can demean and belittle anyone who doesn't affirm him the way he wants to be affirmed. And I know it's easy for most of us in this room to think, all right, yeah, Haman's getting a little out of control. Like I don't have a 7-story stake in my backyard, which I hope is true for all of you. And you're right, it's not in your backyard, it's in your heart. We all have tools that we use to place ourselves above others and to skewer others for our own sake. I can't believe they voted that way. What an idiot. Did you hear what they said or did? They're just so insecure. Well, I just work harder than they do. If they were like me, they'd get the promotion. It's just that they're so ignorant. They just need my knowledge, my experience, my perspective, my book recommendation, and then they'll figure it out. I can't believe they'd be so self-righteous. I would never stoop to that level. You ever find it's amazing how self-righteous you can be about the self-righteous? I'm preaching to myself on that one. So what are your stakes, friends? What are the secret places that you hold in your heart that you use to skewer others? That's the first way pride is destructive. It leads us to build stakes, but it doesn't stop there. Pride also leads us to make some poor choices. Haman, from this point forward, only continues to make poor choices that, as we see next week, will ruin him. When we're prideful, we're never able to learn from our mistakes and make better choices. Because when we make mistakes, we're constantly self-justifying or blaming someone else. It's on them to fix things, not me. And more than that, pride doesn't let us hear criticism. We'll dismiss someone's criticism. That's the superiority side. Or we become completely crippled by their criticism. That's the inferiority side. So pride stunts our growth. It makes us repeat the same mistakes because we don't acknowledge them. It makes us repeat the same patterns because we weren't able to hear what others had to say. It leaves us mired in shame because we can't receive forgiveness or aren't willing to believe that we are truly loved no matter what we do. Many of the poor choices we make extend from pride. You guys, one of the best measurements that someone is growing in humility is the speed with which they're able to admit their mistakes. The speed with which they're able to close the gap between an action and their acknowledgement of where they screwed it up. Humility is often the ability to laugh at ourselves. It's the ability to become unoffendable. We need to become people who are simply able to own what we do and where we screw up, and seek reconciliation and restitution there and move forward in freedom. And when we're prideful, that can never happen. It leads us instead to make poor choices. But it keeps going in this passage. Pride also births endless ugliness in our hearts. I mentioned before it was like this petri dish from which everything else can extend. Some examples for you. Bitterness. Bitterness can only remain in us if we think we are better than someone else. We convince ourselves to stay bitter because we think we'd never do what they did. Because they're just such a terrible person. Bitterness is a child of pride. And worry. When we get paralyzed by worry, it's often because we think we know exactly how things have to go. And if they don't go exactly that way, oh man, we freak out. That takes real pride. That you know exactly how things ought to go. That your way of seeing the world is exactly how the world needs to go. That's a lot of self-elevation. The superiority side of pride is why we become abrasive and opinionated. The inferiority side is what makes us shy or discrediting of ourselves. Pride prevents us from honestly naming our addictive behaviors. It prevents us from actually earnestly engaging people. It makes us manipulative in order to get our way. Pride is the mother of all sorts of brokenness. And maybe the most pervasive part of pride is that it hides itself. By definition, the more proud you are, the less proud you think you are. It's so unlike so many of our other vices. Most of our vices in our lives, we kind of know we're doing them when we're committing them. Nobody embezzles money and they're like, how'd that get in my bank account? Right? No one's gossiping and then says, did I say that? Right? But that's not true with pride. Pride hides itself. Simple example. So far in the sermon, have you been picturing someone you want to send the sermon to? Someone who could really use this message? That's how pervasive this sucker is. It can sneak into our lives by making us prideful about those who are prideful. And even religion can reinforce this. We have to be careful when we come into religious spaces. Jesus' strongest words about pride were for religious people. Because what we can do is we can start to come in here and start to elevate ourselves. Well, I'm doing the right thing, and I follow God, and I worship the right way, or I have the right doctrinal position, or whatever else it is, and we elevate ourselves over others. We can use God as a means to our ends. And so it leads us ultimately to a needed question, friends. What the heck can we do about it? What is the cure for pride in our lives? And we also get a glimpse of it in this passage. Once Haman finished putting together his 7-story masterpiece, a stake, he goes to the king to request the killing of Mordecai, once and for all. And once he does, we actually cut in the story to the palace, where we find the king can't sleep. And I don't know if you noticed what the king asked for when he couldn't sleep. He asked for a biography of himself to be read aloud to him. He said, hey, one of my servants, go ahead and give me the annals of the king. Tell me more about my life. And as he does, he actually remembers a story that he had forgotten years earlier, where Mordecai had actually stepped in and prevented an assassination attempt on his life. And so the king now realizes that nothing has been done to honor Mordecai for that thing. And so he sets out to make it right. He asks his servant if there's any advisors to kind of help him figure out how best to honor Mordecai. And sure enough, Haman is in the courts in the middle of the night. How convenient. And so Haman, well, he's coming to have Mordecai killed, right? So Haman is approaching the king's palace saying, I want to disgrace Mordecai. But he doesn't know that the king says, I want to honor Mordecai. So there's this unspoken thing that we as the audience know is happening, this really awkward and ironic dynamic, where Mordecai thinks the king's talking about him, and the king thinks Haman's talking about Mordecai here. And so he calls Haman in, and he asks him a question. Haman, hypothetically, if there were a man who I wanted to honor and esteem, what would I do for him? And Haman says, this is my moment. He must be talking about me. I was just at the banquet with them. Who else could he possibly be talking about? This is my chance to get all of the approval that I've been looking for. And immediately, he says, well, here's what you're going to do. You're going to put the royal robes on him. You're going to put him on a horse. You're going to put the crown on his head. You're going to make your servants robe him and crown him and lead his horse throughout the whole city so everyone sees how amazing he is. That's what he would want to be done. And there's a bunch of symbolism baked into those things he requests. For instance, the robes and the crown in ancient Persia, those were signifiers of identity. That was the worth of the king. By donning those, you would be indicating that that person had the same level of worth and value, the same significance as the king himself. And the horse, that's what a king would ride when he would return from battle after conquering his enemies. He'd ride through a town and everyone would see that he has power, that he can rule over his enemies. And so this wasn't just like a medal. It wasn't just a way of honoring someone. It was a way of conferring the very identity of the king on the person. They would share in his worth, in his life, in his position. And so what Haman thinks and what he wants here is for everyone to see him as sharing in the glory of the king. He'll think, then I'll have made it. Then I'll have worth. Then I'll matter in the world. He's grasping desperately after approval. And what Haman is showing us is that his request indicates where pride comes from in the deepest parts of our hearts. Our pride comes from this deep inner longing. We want the one we think the world of to think the world of us. We want the one we think the world of to think the world of us. And it starts when we're kids. We deeply want our parents' approval, for them to name us as beloved. And if we don't get it, many of us spend all of our adult lives trying to fill that gap somewhere else. We seek that affirmation in any place we can find it. In friends, looking to be accepted and loved. In work, hoping that all of our success can satisfy that longing. In romantic partners, thinking their loving gaze can really satisfy us. We think that if a person we adore adores us, then we can be fulfilled. And we have wandering souls who are looking for ultimate love, ultimate approval. And then the irony comes in the story. The very thing Haman hoped to grasp for himself goes to the one he hopes to crush. He is ordered to honor Mordecai, and he becomes the servant who guides Mordecai through the city. By seeking his own place, his own elevation, he ends up getting the exact opposite. It's precisely because Haman tries to exalt himself that he gets humbled. And there we see the cure for pride, friends. Haman, his problem isn't that he wanted approval. That's a natural human longing that all of us have from the day we enter the world. As Tim Keller put it, it's not that Haman was looking for the wrong thing, it's that he was going to the wrong king. Haman is looking for the ultimate approval in the deepest parts of his soul from things that can't provide it. And that is always the source of our pride, friends. It's always an attempt to resolve this gnawing in our soul for approval or love with things that can't really satisfy. What we need is the right king. What we need is an eternal, unchanging, unending love that can become the center of our lives and that we can carry with us into every space we inhabit. Because when we have that, we don't need to grasp after the king's robes or his crown. They'll already be ours. And here's the best news, you guys. The right king has come. Not King Ahasuerus, but King Jesus. He descended from his throne and faced the deathly destructive results of all of our pride. He took those results onto himself so that we wouldn't need to face them any longer. He was cast low so that we might be brought high. He was shamed so that we might be accepted. He became a servant so we might become kings. Friends, the only voice that truly matters, which is the voice that created you, that knew you, the voice that has eternal power, that rules over all other voices, that voice has said without hesitation, "You are my beloved." And if you ever question that, look at what I've done for you. I've given my life for you. I've given everything for you. I've risen above all of your prideful striving, and I've put those things to death so you could know love. Unearned, unconditional love. It's yours. That's the only thing that puts our pride to death, friends. We have to have hearts that are melted by this divine king. We need to have our minds and actions shaped by that eternal reality. We need to humble ourselves. And when we do, we find we're exalted. We find an identity that was always ours, one that we never had to earn, but we only had to come home for. And we can rest in the robes and crown of the true king, and we can become like him. It's this remarkable thing when you leave your pride at the feet of Jesus and when you say, "God, I've pursued the wrong things in the wrong ways at the wrong times." And when you turn around to him, he says, "Welcome home." Amen. You get to become the person you were made to be now. The person who gives their life for the sake of others. The person who is truly, deeply humble. And pride withers. Pride gets crucified. Slowly, steadily, we become our true selves. Slowly, steadily, we get cured. That's the proclamation of our King. Would you receive it with me anew today? Amen. Let's pray.